Prepare yourself for tales of the creepy, the terrible, and the awful things that hide in the night. Welcome to these dark spaces. The Child Above. There in the depths of the darkness, beneath the creaking floorboards and hidden from prying eyes, is where I wait. I am a creature born of nightmares, razor-sharp teeth filling a too large mouth, claws like daggers able to rend a man in two with one swipe, and eyes that glow with an otherworldly hue. I am the one that lurks silently in the inky blackness, just out of sight, biding my time. I have gone by many names over the ages, but the most recent one they've given me is only uttered in hushed voices in private spaces. Gravenmaw. The name itself has no power, despite those that I hunt saying it does. The young ones have even made up a game around it. They say that if you stare out into the darkest part of the woods, just beyond the edge of town, and call out my name, beckoning me to come, that I will emerge from the shadows and be at their command. Of course, I do nothing of the sort, but that doesn't stop me from having a little fun. A sharp snap of a branch here, a low, almost imperceptible growl there, and they're running back to their homes in panic. That is, until it was time for my never-ending hunger to be satisfied. It starts as a dull ache deep inside of me, but quickly turns to a white-hot flame, and I can think of nothing else. So, I hunt. I move silently through the town in the late hours of the night, when the shadows are at their deepest, with only the faintest whisper of my steps. Even after all these years, I still have to be careful. I've honed my skills to an expert level, but there are always surprises, especially when the children are involved. But tonight, my hunger burns brighter and stronger than it has in years, threatening to consume me if I don't satisfy it soon. Some homes still have lights glowing in their windows, so I avoid them. Too risky. I'm not completely immortal, after all. There, at the top of the hill, the little dilapidated white house with the red door and the remains of an abandoned garden in the front, once maintained by a father that has since left. Not by my hand, by his own choice, claiming that he couldn't take it anymore and that she was smothering him. I was there in the shadows that night for that argument, listening to them scream at each other while their two children mercifully slept peacefully upstairs. I was there that night for the wife, though. I'd spotted her earlier from the safety of the woods, and my inner hunger sparked to life. All day I imagined how delicious she would be, stoking the red-hot flames inside of me even more, spittle dripping from my mouth. But those plans were stopped short when the argument began and the downstairs lights came on. So I moved on. But now I can hunt in peace. A full year has passed since that day, and the memories of that hunger for her rushed back in full force. I left the safety of the woods, silently crossing the distance to the rear of the house in 2 easy steps. The night was cool, and they had several of the windows open on the lower story, so entry was not a problem. I moved just as silently through the home, taking special care to avoid leaving any trace, and moved towards the main bedroom door there behind the weathered stairs. Inside, I could hear her heavy breathing, deep in slumber, with no idea that her life would be cut short that night. Crawling along the floor, I inched to the side of the bed where she lay, the hunger now consuming every part of my mind. The smell of her was intoxicating, and I breathed deep, savoring it. But then something moved beside her. There in the bed was one of the small ones, the ones that had been blissfully unaware that night I'd visited before. I paused. No, not 2, only 1. That was the way it had always been, and would remain. I could feel the fire inside of me dimming, realizing that my hunger would have to be filled elsewhere tonight. I stepped back into the shadows that fell along the wall there by the bed, cloaking myself in at least a small amount of protection should either of them wake. I studied the small one. Her skin was pale, much paler than her mother's, and her long, jet-black hair lay in a tangled mess around her head on the pillow. Her face was gaunt, but judging by her shape, it was not from malnutrition. The top of her nightgown peeked out from under the blanket, just enough to show a monogrammed name. Emily. I felt drawn to her for some reason. There I stood, staring, searching for a reason for the fascination. It wasn't the hunger. It was something else. Then she stirred and rubbed one eye with a small, balled fist. My mind snapped back into place, and I realized that I needed to leave before... Before what? Was I afraid? I moved back through the house towards the open window I had entered through to escape swiftly, with a bit less grace than before. Rounding a corner, I jostled a small bookshelf, spilling a few books from its overcrowded shelves. I paused only a moment, oddly curious what they might read. A few were the expected children's books, but one thin tome caught my eye because of its worn red leather cover, an embossed symbol inlaid with gold. A face not too different from my own, mouth wide, teeth bared, flanked on either side by folded wings. An odd sensation swept over me, a feeling of familiarity with something. A thump from the direction of the bedroom prompted haste, and in one smooth motion, I leapt through the window, escaping back out into the night to resume my hunt, only for a less desirable meal. Several years passed, and despite many falling victim to my needs, I still could not get that woman, her child, and that book out of my mind. The memory of that night was a constant tug at the back of my mind, taunting me. And so the decision was made for me. Tonight, I would finally quench that desire. I would have her and revel in the delight of a long-awaited meal. I leapt from the woods, just as silent as always, and slipped through the same window, thankful for another cool night. I retraced the same path as before, moving through the kitchen, then the living room, and across the hall at the bottom of those same worn stairs. So close now. I caught the faintest whiff of her scent on the breeze, Then the stairs creaked, and I looked up to see the small one, now grown into a young woman, standing at the top and staring down at me, emotionless. In her hand, she clutched that red book tightly, the gold emblem on the cover glinting in the feeble light filtering in from the bright moon outside. She wore a tattered nightgown that seemed to float around her like a specter. The silence was almost palpable. My gaze locked into hers. Then she took one step down, her soft bare feet making only the slightest of noises. As she continued down the stairs, I felt frozen to the spot. It was only as she grew closer that I could hear her whispering. I couldn't quite make it out, but I could tell it wasn't her native tongue. A few steps more and she opened the book to a page marked by a long red ribbon and began a low chant, accented by surprisingly loud thumps against the book's cover from her small fingers. I was finally able to wrench my gaze away from her and took the chance to escape. But her chanting grew louder, and the thumping of her fingers gave way to heavy pounding as she took each step down those stairs. I felt woozy. My head started to swim and my vision was blurring. Her chanting was now filling every part of my mind. I could feel myself starting to slip away. I fell to the floor mere feet away from where she would soon arrive at the bottom of the stairs. After what seemed like an eternity, my head lolled to the side and I saw her bare feet there next to me. Her nightgown rustled as she leaned over and whispered almost melodically into my ear.
Hello, Graven Moore. You cannot hide from me.
And with that, the blackness overtook me. I awoke with a start, discovering I was no longer at the bottom of the stairs. I looked around in panic, trying to gain my wits, and this new place I suddenly found myself in. There was wood above me and wood below me, rotten and damp in some places, clearly on the eventual road to disintegration. To the sides of me, however, was only open space. I dug my clawed fingers into the wood and worked my way sideways, the wood barrier above me restricting me to not much more movement than that. I neared the edge, so close to freedom. I gave one last push, but instead of freeing myself, I hit hard into something. I tried again, making sure that I was completely clear of the wood barrier above me. I slammed into the same place, stopping dead before tasting freedom. Trapped. With a loud click of the knob, Emily pushed open the door and stepped into the room, a soft, ominous giggle, upon observing me once again trying to free myself. The dim light from the hallway behind her cast eerie too long shadows on the wall. She knelt again and we locked eyes. I froze. She smiled. There was something in her gaze, a deep, ancient knowledge that no child should possess. She opened the book once again, laying it flat on the floor and smoothing out the tattered brown pages. She read aloud,
I am the harbinger of your nightmares.
and though Emily whispered, her voice still somehow echoed through the room.
You may be terrifying to others, but you are nothing compared to the horrors I have seen since my birth. This will forever be your prison. Your hunting has come to an end, and you will forever know hunger, but never be able to feed. You've only been given one gift, one release, to frighten. Yours is now the world below, and while you can move from place to place in that world, choosing to use your one gift or not, you will never be allowed to roam free again.
I threw myself against the invisible barrier again and again. But Emily never even so much as flinched.
Now,
She said quietly and calmly.
if you'll excuse me, I need to fix the bed.
She closed the book and stood. I could still see her feet as rustling came from overhead. The room fell silent again, and she turned and retreated from the room, leaving me trembling in fear, trapped in this prison. I, the monster that had once reveled in the terror of humans, had met my match in a child. A child who held a darkness within her that was far more terrifying than anything I could ever imagine. Emily was a reminder of the vast unknown horrors that lurked in the world, and that I was no longer the true embodiment of fear. In the darkest corners of my black, monstrous heart, I began to come to grips with the fact that I would forever be trapped, tormented by the mere thought of the terrifying child who lived above on this simple prison, the darkness beneath the child's bed. Under lock and key. Jane woke up in complete darkness, disoriented and with a throbbing headache. Her hands were bound together, and her body ached as if she'd been lying on a cold, hard surface for hours. Panic surged through her as she struggled against the restraints, her mind racing, trying to figure out where she was and how she'd gotten there. She remembered leaving work, waving to the cute waiter on the way out, and taking out her keys to unlock her car. But then, nothing. Her memories just stopped, and the next thing she knew, she'd ended up here. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized she was in a small, dank room. The walls were stained with what appeared to be blood, and a putrid smell hung heavy in the air. The only light in the room was emerging from a single bare bulb in a socket high on the wall, its weak light not even enough for her to see beyond a few feet. The wall next to her was rough cinder block that was beginning to crumble a bit from age and seemed to stretch off into the darkness forever in either direction. Jane leapt to her feet, but dropped just as quickly, crying out in pain. It was only then that she noticed her left foot, covered in purple and yellow bruises, swollen and tender to the touch. Broken, she suspected. Yet another mystery. Out of other options, Jane began to scream for help.
Help me, please! Anyone? Can anyone hear me?
She repeated over and over until her voice started getting hoarse. She listened, but still the only sound she heard was her own breathing, the tears rolling down her face, dripping silently to the floor, each reflecting from the light above. She sobbed, her whole body shaking with grief for what seemed like hours. The rough ropes that bound her wrists had already started rubbing her skin raw from her struggles, and she could feel the burn each time she moved. Exhausted and defeated, she laid back down and slipped into a fitful sleep. Her dreams were disjointed. First, she was in a completely white room, the walls covered in doors. When she opened any of them, however, she only found a brick wall blocking her path. Then it shifted to her being outside in a heavily wooded area. She could almost smell the heady scent of the pines and feel the crunch of dried leaves under her feet. Then the first shock came, coursing through her body, and she was knocked off her feet. Jane landed hard in the grass and felt the skin on one of her arms burning. She frantically rubbed it, trying to make it stop, her heart racing. A loud bang from somewhere above her mercifully ripped her from her nightmare. She briefly forgot where she was for a few seconds after waking, but was quickly reminded when that putrid smell hit her nose before she even fully opened her eyes. She heard a few soft beeps from off in the distance to her left, deep in the shadows where the meager bulb couldn't penetrate. A door opened, and the figure of a large man was silhouetted against the bright light that streamed from behind him, so bright that Jane had to cover her eyes.
Well then, look who's up. I was wondering how long it would take for that medicine to stop working.
The man's outline disappeared as he closed the door again, his footsteps echoing across the room, heavy boots thumping hard on the cold floor as he grew closer.
Please, please. Just let me go, I promise. I won't tell anyone anything. Please, please, please.
The man stopped and let out a little chuckle.
I'm sorry, Jane, but I can't do that. You know I can't. The sooner you come to grips with that, the better.
Sobs once again racked her body as she fell back down to the floor, curled up and repeating,
Please, please, please.
over and over. The man walked closer, stepping to the edge of the pool of light just enough so that Jane could see the glint of something in his hand.
Now, be a good girl and let me give you this,
He held out the syringe.
and you'll feel much better.
Panicked, Jane pushed away from him with her good leg, trying to put as much distance between them as possible. But it was no use. The man ran towards her, somehow managing to stay out of the light, and was on top of her before she knew it.
I didn't want to do this the hard way, Jane.
He said as he slammed her bound wrist down to the floor beside her and used his full weight to pin her legs. She tried to fight, but couldn't get free of his hold. It seemed like he was everywhere all at once. She felt a sharp prick in her arm, and the man leapt up, releasing her. He was backlit again, and Jane couldn't make out any of his features, but there was something familiar about him. But the medicine took hold before she could figure it out, and she slipped into unconsciousness. Jane awoke with a start, not sure how much time had passed since the man had attacked her. She looked down and noticed that her ankles were now bound too, the same rough rope digging into her skin, and her broken left foot radiated with a dull ache. She was still in the room and now was even more trapped than before. There was a new smell now, though, something harsh and acrid. Again, she couldn't quite place it. Her mind was still foggy from whatever he'd given her. She thought, and remembered the door. If she could just make it over to it, maybe she could get it open. Jane turned over onto her stomach and began inching along the floor on her elbows and knees. Each movement sent a new shock of pain through her broken foot, but she continued on, determined to make it there before the man returned again. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of crawling through the darkness, she collided with a wall. Her arms ached, and her elbows and knees were bruised from striking against the floor over and over. But she was there. She sat momentarily, relishing the relief, before starting to feel along the wall for the door. She knew about where it was in reference to the small pool of light that one bulb cast still far across the room, but not exactly. Small, sharp edges of cinder-block wall scraped her fingertips, but she ignored it and continued her search. Finally, her hand slid over a smooth surface, and she moved up and felt the cold metal of the handle brush against her hand. Jane excitedly grabbed the handle but stopped short, realizing that she didn't know if the door opened in or out. She also didn't know what she'd find on the other side of this door, and she needed every advantage she could get to escape from here. She was pretty sure at least. Jane slowly pulled the handle down, trying to draw as little attention as possible. But it didn't open. She wrapped the fingers of both hands around the handle and leaned back, putting her full weight into it, thinking maybe it was just heavy. But it still didn't move. Locked. Then she remembered the beeps. It must be locked from the outside by a keypad or something. With no other alternative, she began banging on the door and screaming a loud primal scream. All she knew was rage. She didn't even hear the beeps on the other side of the door or see the handle move down as the door opened again. A man burst through the door, but it wasn't the same man as before. This man was smaller and seemed more frail.
Now, Jane,
He started, but that was as far as he got. Jane leapt towards him, ignoring the searing pain in her foot, and collided with him, both of them falling to the floor. She started pounding his face with her bound hands, each blow landing with a heavy thump. Then a large hand reached out and grabbed her by the shirt, pulling her away from the smaller man. She writhed, trying to avoid this larger man's grasp, but it was no use. He wrapped his arms around her and held her tight. The smaller man stood up and removed something from the pocket of his coat. Jane sobbed, defeated once again, and felt the sharp prick of the needle as it once again pierced her skin. She felt the man's grip loosen as the medicine took hold, and she began to slip into unconsciousness.
At least she's asleep again.
The orderly said sarcastically to the doctor standing next to him. The doctor nodded.
yes, but that's the third time this week we've had to sedate her like that. I don't think any of the therapy we're doing is helping with her delusions. At least, her foot is healing nicely.
The orderly shook his head.
So she just up and killed that guy, right? Didn't even know him. How messed up is that?
He turned to walk away, leaving the doctor alone in the room with Jane. She was strapped to the bed now, wrists and ankles in strong bindings that attached to the bed, still unconscious. The doctor checked over her chart one last time, turned and left the room, closing the door behind him. The Carnival Girl. That world was all I ever knew. That small room with no windows and only the one door. The door that, when I was a good girl, I got to go through and see the bright lights of people. Father used to tell me that when I went out, I was one of the special people. All of the people there were. They all had a mother and father that looked out for them and made sure that they were safe. Do they have special rooms too? I asked him in that small child's voice I had back then. He just smiled and nodded. Yes, Anna, they do. Very special rooms that are just for them, just like yours is for you. I'd smiled and grabbed Father's hand, dragging him towards the cotton candy machine. Looking back now, I realized my room was small. Very small. But it seemed so large for a child of small stature like me. Mother and Father had decorated it for me when I was very young. Bright colors on the walls, so many soft blankets that I could wrap up in, and a bed on the floor where I would sleep each night. Mother and Father loved me very much, and when I was a little bit older, they hung twinkly lights from the ceiling above my bed. Almost every night I would watch them shine, little beacons in the darkness of the room, until my eyes closed to sleep. Mother spent more time with me than Father. Father would go and would sometimes be gone for a long time. Mother would sometimes leave with him too. But I wasn't afraid. I knew the big door with the loud lock would keep me safe while they were gone. I would sit and wait for them, coloring in my book by candlelight or making up little games to keep myself busy. I couldn't wait to show Mother and Father my games when they returned. When they needed to leave for a long time, they would leave food in the small refrigerator by the door for me to eat. I was always a good girl and never ate more than I should for each meal, though. I didn't want them to be disappointed when they came back. If I had been especially good, sometimes I would find a small pink box in the very back of the very bottom drawer with a special treat. I'd always find it right away when it was there, but I was a good girl and didn't eat it until I'd finished my other food. Sometimes I even had some left when they came back. Mother always smelled so lovely, like the fresh air when I would be good enough to go get to see the lights, but more sweet. She would hug me and the scent would cling to me, and I could still smell it hours later sometimes. Father always smelled the same, a heady smell, sometimes punctuated by a small amount of something that made my nose feel funny and itch a little. He would come in, kneel and spread his arms open wide, waiting for me to run to him and cling to his embrace. That was a special place. I felt safe there, wrapped in his large, strong arms and smelling his scent. He would pull back and smile, tussle my hair a bit, and then stand and walk towards the chairs where he and Mother would sit while they were with me. We would smile and laugh and sometimes play games, either pretend ones or the ones that they sometimes brought down with them. My favorite was Candyland. I loved the colors on the board and dreamed of a day when I might go out and see if I could find that place among the lights and music. Then, that night came. We were sitting there, Mother and Father in their chairs, when Father started coughing and putting his hand up to his chest like he was reciting the Pledge of Obedience to the world of light. Mother's eyes had widened, and she raced to his side. Father's breathing wasn't deep and full as it usually was. Mother hooked her arms under his and began to lift, pulling him to his feet and moving towards the heavy door. Mother looked at me, struggling, and then looked at the door, a pleading look in her eyes. I ran to the door and flung it wide. They never locked it when they were with me, there and able to protect me. Mother grunted something that sounded like thank you, and dragged Father through the door and down the hall until she disappeared around the corner at the end. Then there I stood, small and alone. Panic began to set in, as the door was open and Mother and Father were not there to protect me. I threw the door closed, putting my full weight against it to ensure it stayed there. I had hoped that somehow the lock would engage, that some magic would close it so that I could stay safe. But the familiar bang of the lock that I had heard so many times never came. The door stayed closed, but I knew I wasn't safe. I sprinted for my bed, diving under the sheets and blankets, trying to make myself as small as possible and hide from the inevitable evils that I dreamed were coming to take me away. I'm still not sure how long I spent like that, straining to listen to every sound, thinking it might be one of the evil ones Father talked about coming to take me away from them. Finally, I peeked out over one of the blankets, daring to look around the room. The door was still closed, but Mother and Father hadn't returned yet. I'm worried about Father. He was acting strangely when he and Mother left. I'd wanted to help more, but Mother only wanted me to open the door. Not seeing any imminent danger, I slowly pushed back the blankets, and stood beside my bed in silence. After building my courage, I walked over to the door and placed my hand on it. "Mother? Father?" I called out, loud but not so loud that any of the evil ones might find me. No answer. I tried again, a bit louder this time. Still nothing. Just the same complete silence of the room around me. But Father had always taught me to be brave. He said that especially when I got to go see the lights, I had to be brave because there were lots of the others there, and he didn't want anything to happen to me. So I decided I would be brave. For Father. I turned the knob, and a quiet click that was deafening in the silence, bouncing off the bright, hard concrete walls, signaled that it was open. Pulling as hard as my small frame would allow, I opened the door, its hinges squeaking slightly as they had for as long as I could remember, and stared out into the empty hallway. It was well lit from lights above it, much brighter than my special room, but I knew that. I'd seen it when we made trips to see the lights. It always took my eyes a bit to adjust to it when I first came out, blinding me for only a moment before my eyes would get used to the drastic change in lighting. I stood frozen, my mind reeling, trying to decide what to do next. Do I go and see if I can help Mother? She and Father couldn't have gone far. The place with the lights wasn't so big, so it should be easy to track them down. But first, I had to step out. I'd never gone out on my own. Father forbade it. He said that since I was still so small, I needed him with me to protect him from those that hated the light. But eventually, the part of me that loved Mother and Father so much won out, and I took that first step out, crossing the threshold, and stepping out to the cold tile floor in only my bare feet. I discovered the first step was the hardest, and each step after that became easier and easier. I was going to help Mother and Father and make sure that he was okay. My feet moved faster, and I broke into a sprint, covering the ground between my room and the corner in less than a minute. I rounded the corner that I'd gone around so many times but would stop short. The door, the one Father usually opened when we went to see the lights, was closed. Father told me never to open it when it was closed, so bad things don't come in. But I decided that some things are more important than listening to Father right now. He was in trouble, and I had to make sure he was safe. I frantically tried to turn the knob, but it wouldn't move. No matter how much force I used, I could not get it to turn. Tears started rolling down my cheeks, and I pounded on the door, hoping that something somehow would give and it would open. After several minutes, I slumped to the floor, exhausted. I sobbed, not knowing what was going to happen to Father or if they would even return. It was then, there laying on the floor, that I saw the small box hidden behind the grate where the air came in. I looked at it curiously, wiping the last tears away from my eyes, and moved closer. It was small and black, about the same size as the hat Father sometimes wore when we were together. But this was black and shiny, with a small round silver part in the center of it. I pulled at the grate, trying to remove it and get a closer look. It was such a strange place to put such a thing, and I wanted to know more. But the grate wouldn't move. The screws on either side held fast, not even allowing it to wiggle, much less come loose. I sat back and stared at the thing, this small black intrusion into my world. Why had I never seen it before in the times I went up? It was small, but not so small that it wouldn't be easily seen, and not so hidden that it could never be found. Then it hit me. The small coins my father had given me long ago. They were thin and might be able to fit into the slots on the screws. I leapt to my feet, racing back down the hall, and dug through my toy box until I found a small velvet purse that held the coins. I was back at the grate even faster than before and dumped the coins on the floor in front of me, their ringing echoing back down the hall. I tried one, too large, and another, too small. The third coin I tried slotted in perfectly, and with a good bit of effort, I was able to get the first screw to turn. Anticipation was getting the best of me, and it felt like forever until I could get the first screw free. I quickly went to work on the second screw, and it moved more quickly than the first. The screw dropped to the floor, and the grate all but fell out and landed on the floor with a mighty crash. Panic kicked in, and I wondered if those evil ones had heard it. I waited before moving, but no sound came. I quickly snatched up the box and sprinted back to my room, slamming the door behind me so hard that it popped back open. But I didn't care. I turned the box over and over in my hands, hearing things shifting around inside, colliding with the sides with each turn. I inspected the small silver part on the front and stuck my fingernail in the little slot, but nothing happened. Then I remembered about when Father and I would come back from seeing the lights and people. He would pull out his set of keys, put one into the lock that looked much like this, turn it, and the door would open. A key. I needed a key, but where would I possibly find one? I needed to hurry because I knew if Mother and Father found me with this box, they'd probably be very mad at me, and I don't like it when they're mad at me. It scares me. But then I saw it. Mother's bag. In her panic, she must have left it behind. I'd never been allowed to look in her bag, though. That was hers, and it was personal. But Mother wasn't here right now, was she? I glanced back over my shoulder down the hall past the partially open door and unzipped the bag. I rifled through it, searching for something that looked like Father's ring of keys, but came up empty. Maybe Father had taken it with him, along with the other keys. Defeated, I slumped down on the floor next to the bag, knocking it over. A small clink made me look over at the fallen bag, and there, inside of the purse, in a small side pocket, was a glint of silver. I reached over and pulled the small key ring free of the bag, finding one very small key and two large keys. I dove for my bed where the box still lay and fumbled with the smaller key, trying to get it into the lock. Finally, it clicked into place and I turned it, holding my breath. The top popped open, and I lifted it slowly as if something inside might attack. But all I found inside were envelopes. There were 6 envelopes in all, each with a name written on the outside. One of them was mine. Each of the others were full when I shook them, and I could tell that there was something inside, but they were sealed up. Only mine was still open, and there was nothing inside. I didn't dare open any of the others, as I knew that somehow Mother and Father would find out, and then they would yell. Maybe even hit me. But I knew they only did it because they loved me so very much and wanted to make sure that I was a good girl, so that when the time came, I would be accepted into the everlasting light, just like they would someday. I looked down in the box, and there on the bottom were a few small glass containers. They weren't more than a few inches long, and when I held them up to the light, the purplish liquid inside of them oozed back and forth as I tipped it. There were a few that were in the box that were already empty, but there were still 5 more that still contained that purple fluid. I tipped one back and forth, watching the ooze inside slide from side to side. I'd never seen anything so beautiful, even when I got to see the lights. I quickly stashed one of them away in my pocket. I selfishly wanted to be able to take it out at any time to tilt it and watch as the contents of the small glass container moved back and forth slowly. I packed the remaining things back into the box, closed it back up, making sure that the lock on the front was completely closed, and I pushed it back into the grate. I used the coin to rotate each of the screws back into place and walked back down to my room. I hoped Mother and Father would be back soon. It was longer than usual before Mother came back. She was upset. I could tell from the red around her eyes and her constant sniffling. Something had happened to Father. I knew it. Otherwise, he would have come back with her. I moved over to sit beside her there on the padded floor and put my arm around her shoulders. Not quite long enough for me to be able to reach all the way across, but it was the thought that counts, right? Mother cried and moaned, repeating the name Sam over and over again. Mother rocked in place, clutching her knees close to her chest, her tears dripping down onto her knees. It took a long time, but finally Mother stopped crying. She smiled at me and told me everything would be okay and stroked my hair. I didn't realize quite how tired I was until she started running her fingers through my hair. My eyes grew heavy and I drifted off, leaving Mother to deal with her own thoughts. The next morning, Mother was already gone when I woke up. I sat up in my bed and looked around, but she was nowhere to be seen. I suspected she must have left to investigate this Sam she kept talking about. I stretched, feeling every joint and muscle protest at the sudden movement. A small slip of paper was on the floor next to my bed. I snatched it up and read it aloud. "I'll be back in a while. I love you so much, little one," it read. Mother always left me the best notes. I sat and waited for her to return for what felt like hours. But Mother never returned. I was hungry, so I pulled out the small pot that I had and dumped in some beans and cheese. When it was warm enough, I sat down facing the door, scooping the mixture into my mouth. I sat and waited. Time stretched on, and Mother never returned. I had long since finished my meager meal and was starting to get drowsy as the food worked its way through my system and required most of my energy to process. So I stood, forcing my body back into a state of motion and moved towards the door. I needed to know what else was in that box behind the grate, inside those envelopes. I had more courage now. I was a big girl, and I convinced myself that I didn't even care if Mother came in and caught me. So I flung back the door to my room, snatched the coin from the table by the door, and strode down to the grate that hid this buried treasure. It took a few quick turns, and the screws were loose enough to pull the grate free. I pulled out the box, unlocked it with a small key, and once again looked inside. I nervously played with the small glass vial in my pocket. I knew that Mother would be so mad if I opened one of the other envelopes, but I didn't care as much as I used to. Besides, she wasn't even there and hadn't been in a long time. I grabbed an envelope with a different name than my own, one labeled Susan, and slipped my finger between the flap and the top of the envelope, pulling sharply out to open it. The edges ended up a bit ragged, but the first envelope was open. I turned it over, dumping the contents to the tile floor in front of me. It was mostly pictures, mixed with a few small scraps of paper. The pictures were of a small girl with dark hair and olive skin. She was smiling in some of them, but almost looked scared in others. And there, Also in each of these pictures were mother and father. I arranged all of the pictures on the floor in front of me, confused as to what I was seeing. Why were mother and father with this strange girl? Why did they look different? Father had more hair on the top of his head, and mother had less lines in her face. I snatched up another envelope, this one labeled Kathy, and ripped it open as well, dumping the contents on top of the others already there on the floor. There was another girl, thin with almost glowing white skin and fierce red hair. And there, again, were mother and father. They looked even more different than in the other pictures. Mother was thinner, and father didn't have the large stomach that I knew him to have. The clothes they were wearing were different too. I jumped up, trying to process what I was seeing. Who were these girls, and why were they with mother and father if I'd never seen them before? I looked down at the photos at my feed and noticed something I hadn't seen before. All of the photos were taken in the same room. My room. I glanced back down the hall, my mind reeling. I raced back down the hall and practically threw myself onto the bed, slamming the door loudly behind me. I dove back under the covers and, crying, tried to understand. I tried to calm myself. I recited the tenets of the world of light over and over. I'd memorized them long ago after Father had taught them to me, and repeating them soothed me, and soon my heart slowed. Then a loud bang came from the hallway outside. It was the doorway up to the lights being thrown open, the impact of its battered metal echoing deafeningly down the hall as it slammed against the wall behind it. I heard heavy footsteps come down the stairs, then a long silence. A sound like a wounded animal moaning in pain echoed down the hall, and I cowered, wondering if the evil ones had found me after all. The steps started again, this time approaching my room, and my door flung open to reveal Mother standing there in the doorway, photos from the mess I'd made clutched to her chest. Heavy tears rolled down her face, dripping on the photos, making large wet spots where the paper absorbed the tears. "No, no, no," she repeated over and over again. "You weren't supposed to know. You weren't supposed to find out about the others." In 2 quick strides, she was at my bedside, towering over my small frame, a wild kind of anger flashing in her eyes, and a stench on her breath I'd never smelt before. My eyes darted back and forth between the pictures and Mother's enraged face. She lunged for me, narrowly missing the scruff of my shirt as I darted between her legs. She stumbled awkwardly, trying to turn in time to catch me, but it was too late. "You shouldn't know about the other girls," she shouted down the hall and tried to follow me, her feet seemingly too heavy for her to move correctly. She wobbled from side to side as she ran towards me, colliding more than once with the walls. I turned the corner and came to an abrupt halt at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the door to the outside. Mother crashed around the corner and almost lost her footing on the photos that still littered the floor. "Anna," she slurred and reached out towards me, tumbling forward. I leapt up the steps, taking them 2 at a time, and quickly reached the top. Mother was already following, climbing them on all 4s. The photos she'd carried discarded like trash around her. Outside was my only option. "Be brave, Anna," I thought to myself, and turned the knob. This time the door swung open wide, and I was instantly blinded by the warm light streaming in from outside. It was so impossibly bright that it burned as I tried to look around. I could hear people, but I couldn't see them. They sounded far off, not close like when we would come see the lights. Finally, my eyes adjusted to the light around me, and the world I knew was there, but different. The colors were much richer, and I could even count the blades of grass. I stood dazed by this bright, shiny world for what seemed to me like hours. But when I felt that hand grab me around the ankle, I realized it had only been a moment. Mother was pulling at my leg, screaming at me and trying to pull me back down. She stood up, wrapped an arm around my neck, and began to squeeze. I kicked and thrashed, but Mother held firm. It was getting harder to breathe, and a woozy feeling began to overtake me. An image of the glass vial in my pocket flashed through my mind, and I managed to pull it from my pocket. And with the strength I had left, I smashed it against Mother's hand, hoping the sharp pain would be enough to free her hold on me. She yelped in pain as small shards dug into the flesh of her hand, and I smelled something. Something foul. And I saw that where the vial had smashed onto Mother's hand was turning a fierce shade of red and deepening into purple as I watched. "Now look what you've done," she hissed in my ear, still trying to drag me back down those stairs. I heard shouting, but it was far away. Was it me? Was I the one shouting? No, these voices were more like Father's, deeper and rougher. I was suddenly swept up off the ground and could feel Mother's arm being pulled from around my throat. The world began to come back into focus, and I could see two large men holding Mother down to the ground, both wearing the same clothes with a shining symbol attached to the front. One had a hard black thing attached to his belt and held in place by a small piece of leather wrapped around it. My mother fought back, screaming and striking out with both arms and legs, trying to get free. "My baby! Give me back my baby!" she wailed, looking at me with pleading eyes. One of the men looked up, no doubt checking to make sure I was being taken to safety. Mother took the opportunity and, using all of her might, pushed him backwards. As he toppled to the ground, she leapt towards me, her fingernails that she had kept so well manicured digging deep into the arm of the man that held me. He yelped in pain and almost dropped me. Then a loud explosion rang out, and Mother froze, then slumped to the ground, a pool of thick, dark blood forming in the grass around her. I watched in shock, my young mind not fully grasping the situation. Mother's head lifted slightly, her eyes wet and red. She reached towards me, trying to say something, but I couldn't make it out, and then collapsed. The man that held me turned and began to walk away, shielding me from onlookers, and took me over to his car, sat me in the back, buckled my seatbelt, and closed the door. The other men were all standing around Mother's immobile form and looking down at her, handing the photos from the box between them. My heart ached, and I knew Mother was gone. I later found out that Father had passed away the day that he and Mother had rushed out of my room to the surface. His heart had given out and was too far gone by the time he reached help for the doctors to do anything. I was adrift and alone, losing the only two people in my life so quickly, and the pain of it completely consumed me. I'm not sure what I would have done without the help of the nice people that took me in after that. They weren't like Mother and Father, and looked at me oddly when I talked about the world of light and the tenants. But they provided for me, and they told me they really cared about me. And they gave me a room of my own with one door and one window. Your Death Day. Corbin still remembered the day when the first people started to receive their Death Day cards. They were simple white cards, blank on one side, and on the other, the words, Your Death Day, with a date underneath it. Of course, Everyone thought they were some kind of sick joke, until they started coming true. The deaths weren't always anything that would make the papers. Sometimes it was just something as simple as passing away due to natural causes. But the major ones made the papers every time, at least early on. The world was captivated by the cards, and like any good sensation, they eagerly consumed everything they could about it. Sometimes the dates people would be given were years away. Those were the lucky ones. But others would get one that was only a few days away. The latter of the two were, naturally, always the ones that freaked out. They received their cards and almost immediately started panicking, often going slightly mad from the pressure of knowing they only had a few more days to live. No one ever quite knew where the cards came from or where they were going to show up. Some people found them in their mailboxes one day after work. Others would find them in their pockets when trying to pull out their keys. There was even supposedly a man in Boston that received his card in the folio after the waitress returned it when he paid for his dinner. And that was the other thing. The cards were limited to people in the United States. No cards had been received by anyone else anywhere in the world. This, of course, led to rampant conspiracy theories as to where they came from, and suspecting that the source was somewhere in the United States. Nothing ever came out of any of these investigations, of course. It seemed like every time someone was getting close to figuring out the source, they hit a dead end. After a few years, the cards and their death predictions became commonplace. Someone even set up a website, yourdeathday.com, with forums for people to talk about the cards and, of course, death. They even started to organize by the dates of their deaths, creating long forum posts where the people with the same day would congregate and commiserate with those they shared the day with. And of course, there were plenty of onlookers more than happy to chime in with their own opinions. Corbin was one of these. Being in London, he'd of course never received a card, but was so morbidly curious about them and the people that had gotten one of those foreboding little white cards that he spent several hours perusing the website and reading the posts in each day's section. His favorite, though, was following along with the mega topic, "But why?" That had been one of the earliest started on the site. It was a huge thread, with at least 100 new messages added each day, where people were trying to make sense of why the cards started showing up and what they really meant. Early on, some theorized that they were some kind of sick joke, while others thought they were some kind of act of a higher power, trying to humble the human race because we've gotten too proud. The religious zealots had a field day with that last one, of course, claiming that the cards were a sign that the end of it all was near, and that humans were doomed to be condemned, and the cards were their chance to repent. So-called card experts also made the rounds on just about every talk show out there, some promoting some terribly written and mostly useless self-help type book that would supposedly help you deal with getting a card and be at peace, or some other such nonsense. Most people saw them for what they were, though. Charlatans trying to take advantage of the weak just to make a buck. Corbin had seen enough to be a bit more jaded than that. Hanging out at the local pub, he and his mates, a few pints in, of course, would have tipsy debates about the cards. His one friend believed the higher power theory, while another believed that the cards were actually what caused the deaths, that the person wouldn't have died on that date if they'd never received the card. The day after one of their deep conversations, Corbin was at the gym. His head still swam a bit from a bit of overindulgence from the night before, but he'd managed to still get in a decent workout. Fresh from the shower and wrapped in a towel, he dried his hair with another towel before changing. He quickly dialed the combination to his lock with his free hand and opened the locker with a loud thunk. He reached in to grab his shoes and a clean pair of socks when he noticed the corner of a small white piece of paper sticking out from his left shoe. Assuming it was just some kind of promotional material from the gym trying to sell some new training service, he pulled it out quickly and started towards the trash can in the corner. It was only then that he really looked at what he was holding. A small, white card, blank on one side, and when he turned it over, the words, "Your Death Day," printed in neat black letters with the date 4/5/2024 below it. Frozen to the spot, Corbin's mind tried to comprehend what was happening. Only people in the States get cards, right? He thought, panic rising up inside of him. If this was some kind of joke, it was a damn good fake based on the hundreds of pictures of cards he'd seen online. Maybe one of his friends had decided to play a sick joke on him, knowing how much Corbin was into the Death Day cards and the whole mystery around them. But then, how would they know his locker combination to be able to put the card in his shoe? Corbin stuffed it in the pocket of his shorts, tugged on his shoes, and quickly pulled his shirt over his head. He practically sprinted out of the gym, narrowly missing a man on the way out. Those numbers ran over and over in his mind. 4/5/2024. Wasn't that far away, just a few short weeks. His stomach was doing backflips as he climbed into his car and hurried home, thankful for the light weekend traffic. He took the stairs 2 at a time as he raced up to his flat, keys already in hand. Slamming the door behind him, Corbin breathed a sigh of relief. He wasn't exactly sure why, but he felt safer now that he was home. A few deep breaths later, and his heart had calmed back down to normal levels. He took the card from his pocket and inspected it again. The writing was clearly the result of a typewriter of some kind and not printed out from a computer. The cardstock was thick and the edges perfectly cut. It was real. Corbin grabbed his laptop off the table and immediately hit the YourDeathDay.com forums, his hands shaking as he typed, "WTF, I got a card." He then shared more about his location, where he'd found the card, and, of course, the day of his death. The board went absolutely wild with responses. Everything from people claiming he was a fraud and a liar, out to the usual sympathy that he had even received a card. Eventually, even the news media picked up on it. Local TV stations and papers hounding him for interviews. It got so bad that he stopped answering his phone, opting to let them fill up his voicemail instead. All of the attention wasn't doing anything to help his ever-growing dread. 4/5/2024 was just 2 weeks away now. Corbin's mind was flooded with morbid thoughts, wondering how he might die. Paranoia began to creep in, and he started looking around his small flat at everything as if it was the enemy that could be the ultimate cause of his death. So he started to clear out some of his belongings, hiding some away in the small closet he had in his bedroom and giving away others to friends and neighbors. With just 1 week left, Corbin's flat was practically empty, save for some of the larger pieces of furniture that were too difficult to move. He decided that staying inside on that day was his best chance to try and cheat death. Of course, no one, no matter how prepared they'd been, was ever able to have death move on and not take them on their day. But Corbin was resolved to be the first. He'd even built up a sort of bunker from his mattress, some pillows, and the side of his couch where he could hide. He'd already resolved himself to giving up ingesting anything that day for fear it could somehow be tainted. He'd also unplugged every electrical device that remained, removing anything even remotely sharp, and even covered the floor with a plastic sheet, just in case. Finally, the day arrived. Corbin hadn't been able to sleep well all week and was feeling the effects of sleep deprivation, his eyes often heavy and his body feeling weakened and sore. Corbin stared at his watch in the meager light coming from the moon outside, watching it creep closer and closer to midnight. Corbin took in a sharp breath as the final seconds ticked by, waiting for catastrophe to strike as soon as midnight hit. But nothing happened. He let out the breath he'd been holding and listened intently, trying to discern if anything was amiss. Still, nothing. He spent most of the day that way, just waiting and listening. But noon came and still nothing had happened. His mind was hazy and he was having trouble holding on to thoughts for very long, but he did start to wonder if maybe it was a hoax after all. Maybe someone somewhere is sitting at their computer, laughing at his messages, knowing they'd made a fool out of him. 5 p.m. came and went, and still nothing. Corbin's nerves were shot, and every small creak, groan, or bang from around him hidden away in his fort made him jump. Anticipation, combined with the sleep deprivation and the growing hunger inside him, was driving him mad. 10 p.m. Still nothing. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours. It felt like he'd been sitting in the same spot, there on the hard floor, for days. Exhaustion began to overtake him, and his eyes drooped, and his body relaxed. Corbin's breathing deepened as he drifted off to sleep. His body finally pushed to the breaking point and couldn't take it anymore. Corbin's eyes snapped open, and it took a few seconds to adjust to the light streaming in from outside. Morning. It was morning. He double-checked his watch to make sure. He'd made it. He'd cheated death. His day had come and gone, and he was still here. He immediately leapt up and raced to his computer, the one piece of electronics he didn't part with, and sat on the floor in the corner. Pulling up the forum, his fingers flew over the keys as he shared the good news. Everyone needed to know about his survival, that it was possible to cheat death. The forum went wild once again, with many asking him to prove it. He looked frantically for something he could use to prove the date on his card and today's date. With nothing around, he raced down the stairs to grab a copy of the Daily Mirror, only stumbling once and running completely on adrenaline. He took a picture of himself holding up both the card and the paper, looking a bit worse for the wear, but still smiling. Predictably, a few days later, his phone began to ring with media contacts wanting to know how he'd done it and what was so special about him. He'd even appeared on a local access TV show to tell his story. But as with all sensations, people moved on to the next major story pretty quickly. Within 2 weeks, they'd stopped calling completely, and Corbin was happy to have his life return to normal. He'd already restored most of his apartment back to its former state and had even gotten some of the things back from his friends. He tucked the card into his wallet, a reminder of what had happened. He decided that he was going to live his life to the fullest. It had taken Corbin a while to get back to life as usual, with that nagging feeling that death might still come for him always in the back of his mind. But that was dimming with each day that passed. He went back to work each day, enjoyed time with friends, even went on a date with the cute girl from accounting, Sarah, that he'd never managed to work up the courage to ask out. One night, they were out on a date, just leaving a movie, a terrible documentary that someone had made about the cards and how they'd changed society, and they headed to dinner. They talked about their own favorite movies, and she even laughed at some of his terrible jokes. She told him how she was looking forward to trying the restaurant, as she'd heard it was wonderful from some of her friends. They stopped at the corner of a busy intersection, waiting for the sign to change and tell them it was safe to walk across. Corbin was really starting to feel a connection with Sarah and caught a hint that she might have deeper feelings for him, too. He smiled at her, and she smiled back, and he became lost in his own thoughts. And absent-mindedly stepped off the curb. The collision was almost immediate, the car being only about 20 feet away when Corbin stepped in front of it. His body flew forward like a rag doll as the car's tires screamed on the asphalt as the driver slammed on the brakes. Corbin's body lay in the center of the intersection, unmoving, his right arm clearly broken, and a bone jutting out from his leg, a chunk of ragged flesh hanging from the end. Several onlookers were already talking to 999 and trying to get help there as quickly as possible. Sarah ran out into the intersection. Thankfully, all the traffic around it had completely stopped. She reached Corbin's side, sobbing, trying to figure out if there was anything she could do. She reached out, wanting to see if he was okay, but recoiled whenever he coughed and spat blood onto the road next to him. She sat there with him, holding his hand, until the paramedics arrived. But by then, it was too late. As they lifted his body up on the stretcher to move it, Corbin's wallet fell from his back pocket. When she picked it up, Sarah noticed a small piece of paper tucked into the back, one corner stained red from where it had laid in Corbin's blood. It was his card. She pulled it from the wallet. "Your death day," she read aloud, holding the card out in front of her, and then gasped when she saw the date, 4/5/2024. It was today, May 4th, 2024. Thank you for listening to These Dark Spaces. We hope you enjoyed this story. You can find out more about us at thesedarkspaces.com or follow us on Twitter at thesedarkspaces. If you've enjoyed listening, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite listening platform. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, keep your senses sharp, and your mind open.